Welcome to the channel, Crime of Slaves. The story today follows a young enslaved boy who made his escape into the Old West and, defying every expectation, transformed into the most feared gunslinger Texas had ever seen. His past was deliberately erased. His true name was buried. Yet somehow, his story managed to survive. What follows is a raw and intense journey through violence, survival, and a profound transformation. Take a breath now, settle in, and listen closely. Before we get started, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments which city and country you're tuning in from. Your support and participation are what keep these stories alive and ensure they are remembered, not erased. So, let's begin. It was the summer of 1873. A man dressed in head-to-toe black stepped into a saloon located in Dusty Creek, Texas. He cut an imposing figure, tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway. His complexion was as dark as a midnight sky. But it was his eyes that gave men pause. They held something inside them that made even the toughest stare at the floor. Within the span of 60 seconds, he had drawn his revolver and fired a single bullet through the skull of a man named Thomas Birch. Before the patrons could even register what had happened, the stranger had vanished into the harsh, blazing afternoon sun. That one gunshot would reverberate throughout Texas for the next 2 years. It marked the opening salvo in a relentless campaign of vengeance that would ultimately claim the lives of 18 men. It was a declaration, a message that a ghost had returned to collect on debts white men believed were buried and forgotten long ago. His name was Zachariah Creed. Born into bondage, he made his escape at the tender age of 13. He was later trained by a legendary Mexican gunfighter, and his singular purpose became hunting down every man who had ever caused him to bleed. The newspapers of the day branded him a monster. The wanted posters labeled him a dangerous outlaw. But the enslaved people who still carried his memory, they called him something else entirely. They called him vengeance. To truly comprehend how Zachariah Creed evolved into the most feared man in Texas, we must travel back to the very beginning. Not to the moment of his birth, but to the day his mother died. Because that is where this story truly ignites. That is the precise instant the boy, known as Zachariah, perished, and something else, something dark and unyielding, rose up to take his place. Our story takes us back to 1858. The setting was a sprawling cotton plantation, roughly 40 miles west of Houston, Texas, known as the Whitmore Estate. Its owner was a man who insisted on being called Colonel Henry Whitmore. He wasn't a real colonel, of course. He had never served a day in any military, but in the antebellum South, it was common practice for wealthy plantation owners to bestow military titles upon themselves, hoping to sound more important than they were. Colonel Whitmore presided over 3,000 acres of land and held 112 human beings in bondage. He was widely regarded as one of the most successful planters in the entire region. His cotton fetched premium prices in the markets of New Orleans. His name would appear in newspapers, held up as a prime example of Southern prosperity and achievement. What those newspapers conveniently failed to mention was the true foundation upon which that prosperity was built. There was no mention of the brutal whippings, no mention of the branding irons used to mark human property. No mention of families being torn apart, mothers and fathers sold away from children like so much livestock, and certainly no mention of the bodies laid to rest in unmarked graves hidden behind the cramped slave quarters. Colonel Henry Whitmore was, by any moral standard, a monster. But in the Texas of 1858, monsters of his ilk were politely referred to as gentlemen. Zachariah was born into this brutal system on the Whitmore plantation in the year 1847. His mother's name was Abigail. She worked within the main house as a domestic servant, her days consumed with cooking meals, scrubbing floors, and catering to the every whim of the white family. Among the other enslaved people, Abigail was known for two distinct things: her profound kindness and her remarkable voice. As she worked, she would sing hymns. They were old spirituals passed down from her grandmother. Songs that spoke of Moses, of freedom, and a promised land waiting just beyond the river. The others would say, her voice had the power to move you to tears, even if the words themselves were unfamiliar. Zachariah grew up with that voice as his constant companion. In a world filled with nothing but ugliness, it was the single most beautiful thing he knew. In the darkness of the crowded slave cabin they shared with 6 other families, Abigail gave her son his name in secret: Zachariah. It was a name taken from the Bible. Its meaning was profound. God remembers. Every single night, before sleep took him, she would whisper it to him. Your name means God remembers, she would say. He takes note of every hurt, every single tear, every wrong that's ever been done to his children. And one day, he will make it all right. You hold on to that, baby. No matter what they do to you, you remember God remembers. When Zachariah was just 3 years old, his father was sold away to a different plantation in Louisiana. The boy had no memories of the man, only the stories his mother would share. He was told his father had been a strong man, a field hand capable of picking 300 pounds of cotton in a single, grueling day. He had been sold simply because Colonel Whitmore found himself in need of money to acquire more acreage. That was the cruel calculus of the system. Human beings were converted directly into land. Fathers were turned into fields. Zachariah would never lay eyes on his father again. He would never even learn if the man had lived or died. That was the horror of slavery. In the span of a single night, you could lose everyone and everything you held dear, and not a single person would think to tell you where they had gone. By the tender age of 5, Zachariah was already expected to work. He wasn't sent to the fields yet. He was too small for that back-breaking labor. But on a plantation, there was always work for small hands. His days were filled with carrying water to the exhausted field hands, gathering eggs from the chicken coops, sweeping the dirt paths that wound around the main house, and running errands for the white family. Fetching items, delivering messages. The Whitmore children, 2 boys and a girl, roughly his age, would sometimes amuse themselves by throwing rocks at him. If Zachariah dared to cry, he was whipped. If he tried to run, the whipping was even worse. He learned this lesson with brutal efficiency: do not cry. He learned to craft his face into a mask that revealed absolutely nothing. This was his first, most fundamental lesson in survival. The head overseer on the Whitmore plantation was a man named Thomas Birch. Birch wasn't a man of wealth himself. He hailed from poor white stock, the kind the plantation owners would derisively refer to as white trash behind closed doors. But Birch had found his calling. He had discovered a deep, abiding satisfaction in causing pain. He was exceptionally good at it. Colonel Whitmore paid him well for his services, relying on him to maintain discipline among the slaves, and Thomas Birch earned every single cent. His tool of choice was a whip made of braided leather, with small metal weights meticulously woven into the tips. When that whip connected with flesh, it didn't just bruise, it tore. It left behind scars that would never, ever fully heal. Birch wielded that whip almost daily. He would claim it was a necessary measure to maintain order. But anyone who took the time to watch him work could see the plain truth. He enjoyed it. A grim smile would play on his lips as he swung. A laugh would escape him when they screamed. Zachariah was 7 years old on the day his mother died. It was a Tuesday in the brutal month of August. The heat was a physical presence, well over 100 degrees. the kind of oppressive heat that made the very air seem to shimmer like water. Abigail was working in the main house that day, preparing the midday meal for the Whitmore family. She was carrying a large, heavy ceramic jug of milk from the kitchen through to the dining room. The jug was slick in her hands, her palms slippery with sweat. It slipped from her grasp. It fell, shattering on the polished hardwood floor, sending a river of milk spreading across the immaculate surface. Mrs. Whitmore, the colonel's wife, happened to be in the room when it happened. She screamed, not from any injury. The jug hadn't come anywhere near her. She screamed because a slave had dared to break something that belonged to her, because a black woman had made a mess in her beautiful dining room, and because she was hot and irritable, and in desperate need of someone to punish. She immediately called for Thomas Birch. What transpired next would be seared into Zachariah's memory for the remainder of his life. Every detail, every sound, every image was burned into his consciousness with a permanent, unrelenting fire. He was outside the house, sweeping the front path. When he heard his mother scream, he ran. He knew he wasn't supposed to run. Slaves were never to be seen running anywhere near the main house, but the sound of his mother's voice overrode everything. His legs moved before his mind could even form the thought to stop them. He rounded the corner of the house and saw them gathered in the yard behind the kitchen. Thomas Birch had his mother tied to a wooden post. Her dress had been torn away from her back, leaving her flesh exposed. Birch stood behind her, whip in hand. Mrs. Whitmore observed from the cool shade of a pecan tree, fanning herself slowly, a faint smile playing on her lips. Colonel Whitmore stood beside his wife, arms crossed, wearing an expression of bored indifference. For them, this was routine. This was entertainment. Birch raised the whip and brought it down with a sickening crack. The sound it made upon impact was something indescribable. A cross between a sharp crack and a wet, brutal slap. Abigail screamed. Bright red blood bloomed against her dark skin. Birch raised the whip again, and again and again. Zachariah tried desperately to run to his mother. Another overseer grabbed him, holding him in a vice-like grip. "Watch, boy," the man hissed in his ear. "Watch what happens when you people forget your place." And he watched. He had no choice. He stood there, counting silently, as Thomas Birch brought the whip down on his mother 37 times. He counted every single stroke. He heard her screams devolve into moans, and then finally into an awful silence. He watched her body go limp against the post. He watched Birch finally stop, breathing heavily from the exertion, wiping the sweat from his brow. He watched Colonel Whitmore nod his approval, turn, and walk back toward the house with his wife, as if nothing of any consequence had just occurred. They left Abigail tied to that post. She was still breathing, but only barely. The other enslaved people were forbidden from helping her until nightfall. By then, it was far too late. She had lost too much blood, and the wounds had already begun to fester in the oppressive August heat. A fever set in that night. By the time dawn broke, she was dead. Zachariah was not permitted to attend her burial. He was given no chance to say goodbye. That very same morning, he was sent to the cotton fields. Colonel Whitmore had decreed that 7 years old was now old enough to begin picking cotton. There was to be no time for grief. There was no space allowed for mourning. There was only the endless work. But something fundamental had shifted inside Zachariah. Something had broken, or perhaps something entirely new had been born. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't attempt to run. He simply went to the fields and picked cotton with hands still too small for the brutal task. That night, he returned to the cabin and lay down in the exact spot where his mother used to sleep. And there, in the darkness, he made a solemn promise. not to God, and not to any unseen listener, but to himself. He promised that one day he would find Thomas Birch. He would find Colonel Whitmore. He would find every single person who had stood there watching while his mother died. And he would make them all pay. Every last one. The 2 years that followed were the most grueling of Zachariah's young life. He labored in the fields from the moment the sun crept over the horizon until it disappeared. The sharp, prickly cotton bolls tore at his small, inexperienced fingers until they were raw and bleeding. The relentless Texas sun blistered his skin. The overseer's whips fell on any slave who failed to meet their daily quota. Zachariah rarely met his quota. He was simply too young, too small, too new to the brutal rhythm of the work. He was whipped at least once a week, often more. The scars on his back began to layer one on top of another, creating a textured map of suffering that spanned from his shoulders down to his waist. Yet he did not break. That was the detail the overseers began to notice. That was the thing that caused them unease. Most slaves, when whipped repeatedly, developed a particular look in their eyes. A dullness, a look of complete defeat. The spirit would simply drain out of them. They would become docile, compliant, easier to manage. That was the entire purpose of the whippings, after all. Not merely to punish, but to systematically destroy the will to resist. Zachariah never acquired that look. His eyes remained sharp, intensely focused, constantly alert. When the overseers looked into those eyes, they saw something that disturbed them on a primal level. They saw hatred. Not the hot, impulsive hatred that might cause a man to do something stupid and get himself killed. This was something else entirely. This was cold, patient, and utterly controlled. Thomas Birch noticed it once and remarked to a fellow overseer, "That one's got the devil in him. We're going to have to sell him off before he's fully grown. He's the type that murders masters in their sleep." In 1859, when Zachariah was 9, Colonel Whitmore committed an act that would haunt the boy for the rest of his existence. He sold Zachariah's younger sister. Her name was Grace. She was just 6 years old. Since their mother's death, Zachariah had been her protector. He made sure she had something to eat. He shielded her from the older children who might harm her. At night, he would tell her the same stories their mother used to tell. Stories of Moses and freedom, and a land where no one was ever sold away. Grace was the only family Zachariah had left in the world. She was the only person he still loved. One morning, a man arrived at the plantation in an ornate carriage. His name was William Crawford, and he was a slave trader operating out of Houston. He had come to inspect Colonel Whitmore's inventory of slaves and make some purchases. This was a regular occurrence on plantations. Slave traders would pass through like traveling salesmen, hunting for bargains, tearing families apart with nothing more than the stroke of a pen. Crawford walked through the slave quarters alongside Colonel Whitmore, examining the human merchandise with a critical eye. He squeezed muscles, checked teeth, inquired about health and temperament. When his gaze fell upon Grace, he stopped. "That one," he said, pointing. "How much for the girl?" Zachariah watched from 20 feet away. He was frozen, unable to move or speak. Slaves had no right to object when members of their family were sold. They had no rights at all. He stood there, completely paralyzed, as Colonel Whitmore and William Crawford negotiated the price of his little sister. They eventually settled on $400. Grace was taken away that very same day. As they loaded her onto the wagon, she screamed for Zachariah. Her small hands reached out desperately toward him. "Zach! Zach! Please don't let them take me!" He ran toward the wagon. An overseer met him with the butt of a rifle, striking him in the head. When he regained consciousness, Grace was gone. He never saw her again. He never learned where she had been taken. That day, he added 2 more names to his ever-growing list: Conal Whitmore and William Crawford. One day, they would pay. The only thing that kept Zachariah remotely grounded during those brutal years was Samuel. Samuel was another enslaved boy, roughly Zachariah's age, perhaps a year older. They had known each other since they were very small. But after the death of Zachariah's mother and the sale of his sister, Samuel became something far more significant. He became Zachariah's sole friend, his only remaining connection to anything resembling hope. Samuel was a stark contrast to Zachariah. Where Zachariah was quiet and perpetually watchful, Samuel was talkative and quick with a smile. Where Zachariah kept his hatred locked away deep inside, Samuel seemed to have made a kind of peace with their impossible situation. "We can't change what they do to us," Samuel said one night as they lay in the crowded cabin, waiting for sleep. "The only thing we can control is what's inside of us. I'm not going to let them make me hate. That's giving them way too much power." Zachariah didn't agree. Hate was the only fuel that kept him going. But he loved Samuel regardless. Samuel was the one person who could still coax a laugh from him. He was the one person who reminded him that goodness still existed in the world, even in a place as terrible as this one. Together, they would make plans. Whispered plans in the darkness. One day, they would escape. They would run north to the Free States, or perhaps west to the territories, where they said a black man could start over. They would find Zachariah's sister and bring her with them. They would build a new life somewhere far away from cotton fields and whips and men like Conal Whitmore. These plans were almost certainly impossible. They both understood that. But simply having them, speaking them aloud into the night, made the unbearable days somehow bearable. In 1860, when Zachariah was 12, the world beyond the plantation began to shift. Fragments of news filtered down to the enslaved people through overheard conversations and information, carried by slaves from neighboring plantations. There was talk of war. The northern states and the southern states were on the brink of conflict over the issue of slavery. Some said the North intended to free all the slaves. Some said there would be no more buying and selling of human beings. Some whispered that freedom was finally coming. Conal Whitmore grew visibly nervous. He increased the patrols around the plantation. He ordered the overseers to whip anyone caught discussing the war. He declared publicly that if any slave dared to attempt escape, he would hunt them down personally and make an example of them that the others would never, ever forget. The message was unmistakably clear. War or no war, nothing was going to change on the Whitmore plantation. They were property. They would remain property. And anyone who entertained thoughts to the contrary would suffer unimaginably. The event that finally shattered Zachariah's resolve and propelled him toward escape occurred on a bitterly cold night in December of 1860. Samuel had been caught stealing food. It was a single piece of bread. That was all. Just one piece of bread, taken from the kitchen. Samuel hadn't eaten in 2 days. He had given his own meager portion to a younger child who was sick. He was simply hungry. So he took a piece of bread. The punishment for stealing was death. Conal Whitmore made the announcement himself, with great solemnity. He gathered all the enslaved people in front of the main house. He spoke in that calm, reasonable voice of his, the voice he used when he wanted everyone to understand just how fair he was being. "Stealing is a crime," he declared. "A crime against me, against this plantation, and against the natural order that God himself has established. This boy has stolen from me, and he will now pay the price that God demands." They hanged Samuel from a pecan tree in front of the entire assembled population. Thomas Birch placed the rope around his neck. Two other overseers lifted him up and let him drop. Samuel did not die quickly. The drop hadn't been long enough to break his neck. He strangled slowly, his feet kicking desperately, his hands clawing at the rope, his eyes bulging horribly. The entire agonizing process took almost 5 minutes. Zachariah was forced to watch every second of it. When it was finally over, Colonel Whitmore ordered that Samuel's body be left hanging there for 3 full days. A gruesome warning to anyone else who might consider stealing. A stark reminder of what happened to slaves who forgot their place. For 3 days, Zachariah had to walk past Samuel's decomposing body on his way to and from the fields. He watched the birds come. He saw the flies. He witnessed exactly what death looked like, when it was left to rot in the open air. On the 3rd night, Zachariah made his decision. He waited until the moon slipped behind the clouds, plunging the area into darkness. He crept out of the cabin while everyone else slept. He found a knife in the blacksmith's shed and used it to cut Samuel down from that tree. The body was stiff and had begun to smell. Zachariah didn't care. He carried his friend's remains over his shoulder to a spot behind the slave quarters where the earth was soft. He dug a grave with his bare hands. It took him 3 hours. When the hole was deep enough, he gently placed Samuel inside and covered him with dirt. He didn't say a prayer. He no longer believed in any God. A God who would allow his mother to be whipped to death. A God who would let his sister be sold away like an animal. A God who would permit his best friend to die for a single piece of bread. That was no God worth praying to. But he made another promise. He promised Samuel that his death would have meaning. He promised that he would escape, he would survive, and he would come back one day to make every single person on this plantation answer for what they had done. Then Zachariah ran. He had no plan. He had no supplies. He possessed nothing but the clothes on his back and the burning hatred in his heart. He crawled under the fence at the western edge of the plantation and began moving west, always west. Away from the fields, away from the whips, away from everything he had ever known. He was 13 years old. He was utterly alone in the vast Texas wilderness. He had never, in his entire life, been off that plantation. He didn't know how to hunt. He didn't know how to find water. He had no idea where he was going or how he would ever get there. He knew only one thing with absolute certainty. He would rather die free than live one more single day as a slave. The first 3 days were, without question, the worst of his life. Zachariah moved only at night and hid during the daylight hours, knowing the overseers and their hired trackers would be searching for him. He had no food. He found water in a creek and drank until his stomach ached. He ate berries he desperately hoped weren't poisonous. He kept pushing westward, navigating by the stars, just as Samuel had taught him during their whispered conversations about escape. On the 4th day, he heard the dogs. Colonel Whitmore had hired professional slave catchers, hunters who specialized in tracking down escaped slaves. They had hounds trained to follow a human scent for miles. They had horses and guns and years of experience. They had captured dozens of runaways over the years. They had never failed. Zachariah heard the baying of the hounds approaching from the east. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew he couldn't outrun dogs. He knew that if they caught him, he would be dragged back to the plantation. He would be whipped savagely. He might even be hanged, like Samuel. At the very best, he would be branded as a runaway and sold further south, to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where slaves were literally worked to death within a few years. He ran anyway. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs finally gave out beneath him. He collapsed in a dry creek bed and couldn't get back up. The baying grew louder. They were getting closer. He could hear the horses now, and the shouts of the men. He was going to be caught. Then he saw it. A hole. It was an opening in the creek bank, partially concealed by exposed roots and a layer of dead leaves. A hole that looked just big enough for a boy to squeeze into. Zachariah didn't hesitate. He pushed himself into that hole, wiggling frantically through the narrow opening until he was completely hidden from view. He found himself in a small underground space, barely large enough to sit up in. It was pitch black and smelled strongly of damp earth and decay. Something small skittered over his foot, probably a snake or a rat. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. The dogs reached the creek bed, just minutes later. He could hear them sniffing and howling in confusion. The water in the creek had washed away his scent. The hole was positioned downwind. The dogs circled and barked, but they couldn't find him. The slave catchers cursed loudly and kicked at their frustrated animals. He must have gone into the water. One of them said, he could be anywhere by now. Spread out. Check downstream. They moved on. Zachariah stayed hidden in that hole for 6 more hours, until long after all sounds of the search party had faded completely. When he finally emerged, the sun was beginning to set. He was alive. He was free. And he was more profoundly alone than he had ever been in his entire existence. For the next 3 years, Zachariah managed to survive in the unforgiving wilderness of West Texas. This was not the civilized Texas of sprawling cotton plantations and southern gentlemen. This was the true frontier. Vast, empty stretches of desert and scrubland where few white men had yet settled. This was Comanche territory. This was outlaw country. This was a place where a black boy with no papers and no protector could vanish completely without a trace. He learned to survive the hard way, through relentless trial and error, by nearly dying, and then figuring out what he had done wrong. He learned which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. He learned to find water by observing where the animals went to drink. He learned to catch small game using traps he crafted from sticks and vines. He learned to create fire using flint and steel he'd found in an abandoned campsite. He learned to read tracks, to sense when predators were nearby, to navigate the landscape without leaving any trace of his passage. The wilderness was brutal, yes, but it was also honest. It didn't hate him for being black. It didn't consider him property. It simply was. Survive or die. Adapt or perish. There were no masters here, no overseers, no whips. Just the land and the sky and the daily struggle to see another sunrise. Occasionally, he encountered other people. Outlaws hiding from the law. Comanche hunting parties. Mexican traders moving goods back and forth across the border. Some of them tried to hurt him. Some of them actually tried to help. He developed the ability to read people the same way he read tracks, to know within seconds whether someone intended him harm. He grew hard. He grew watchful. He grew dangerous. The soft parts of him, the parts that had once known how to love and trust, retreated deep inside, to a place where nothing could ever touch them again. By the time he was 15, Zachariah had endured things that would have killed most grown men. He had been bitten by a rattlesnake and had to cut the venom out of his own leg using a stolen knife. He had nearly frozen to death during a blue norther that dropped temperatures by 40 degrees in less than an hour. He had fought off a mountain lion armed with nothing but a sharpened stick, and he had killed 2 men who tried to rob him and sell him back into slavery. Yes, he had killed. The first time had been the hardest. A white man in a ragged coat found him sleeping in a cave and decided that a black boy alone in the wilderness represented easy money. The man had a knife and a rope, and a smile that suggested he had done this kind of thing before. Zachariah had only a rock, but the man underestimated him. They always underestimated him. By the time the fight was over, the man was dead, and Zachariah was left holding the knife. He felt nothing, no guilt, no horror, just a cold, quiet satisfaction that one more person who had wanted to hurt him could never hurt anyone ever again. The second killing was easier. The third, easier still. Zachariah was in the process of becoming something. He didn't yet have a word for it, but he could feel it growing inside him. A capacity for violence that had been planted the day his mother died, and had been steadily watered by every cruelty inflicted upon him since. In the spring of 1863, half dead from fever and starvation, Zachariah stumbled into the camp of a man who would fundamentally change his life. The man was Mexican. He was old and gray-haired. He sat beside a small fire in a canyon deep within the mountains, calmly roasting a rabbit on a stick. A rifle rested across his knees, and 2 revolvers hung on his belt. His face was weathered and deeply scarred. His eyes held the look of someone who had witnessed far too much death, and had long since made his peace with it. Zachariah collapsed at the edge of the firelight. He was far too weak to run, far too weak to fight. If this man wanted to kill him, there was absolutely nothing he could do to prevent it. But the old man didn't reach for his weapons. He simply watched the boy lying there in the dirt. This skeleton wrapped in dark skin, this wild, desperate creature with eyes that still burned with an inner fire. After a long, measured moment, the old man finally spoke. "You look like death itself, boy. Do you plan on dying right here in my camp?" Zachariah summoned the last of his strength to answer, not planning on dying anywhere. "Not yet." The old man smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized something deeply familiar. "Good," he said. "Dying is the easy part. Living, that's the real challenge." He tossed a piece of rabbit meat toward Zachariah. "Eat. You're far too skinny to be worth killing right now. Maybe once you fatten up a bit, I'll reconsider." The old man's name was Joaquin Esparza. According to official records, he wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Authorities in 3 Mexican states and 2 American territories had declared him dead for over a decade. He had been reported killed in Chihuahua back in 1851, then again in Sonora in 1854, and once more in New Mexico Territory in 1857. Each report was convincing. Each came with witnesses and specific details. And each one was completely false. Joaquin Esparza had simply become extraordinarily skilled at disappearing. In his younger days, Joaquin had been something of a legend. He had ridden with various groups of irregulars and bandits along the border during the Mexican-American War. After the war ended in 1848 and Mexico lost half its territory to the United States, Joaquin continued fighting. Not for any government or any particular cause, but for revenge. He watched helplessly as American settlers took land that had belonged to his family for generations. He watched Mexican farmers driven from their property at gunpoint. He watched an entire way of life systematically destroyed by men who believed their white skin gave them the divine right to take whatever they wanted. So he took it back. He robbed stagecoaches carrying gold from California. He ambushed army patrols that strayed too far from their forts. He killed men who deserved killing, and some who probably didn't. He became a ghost story that American mothers told their children to keep them from wandering too far from home. He became a name that made lawmen nervous and politicians angry. But revenge is exhausting. Violence takes a profound toll on the soul, even when it's fully justified. By the time he reached his 40s, he was tired. Tired of running. Tired of killing. Tired of waking up every single morning wondering if this would be the day someone finally collected the bounty on his head. He staged his own death one final time and retreated deep into the mountains of West Texas. He built a small cabin in a canyon so remote that even the Comanche rarely passed through. He lived completely alone. He hunted. He grew vegetables in a small garden. He tried with all his might to forget everything he had once been. Then Zachariah Creed collapsed at the edge of his campfire, and Joe Keane saw something that made forgetting utterly impossible. "You have the eyes," Joe Keane said one evening, about a week after Zachariah had arrived. The boy had recovered enough to sit up and eat solid food. He was still weak, but the fever had finally broken. He would survive. "What eyes?" Zachariah asked. "The eyes of a man who has already made the decision to kill. I have seen those eyes before. I saw them in my own mirror, many years ago." Joaquin poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "Who do you want to kill, boy, and why?" Zachariah remained silent for a very long time. He hadn't spoken about his past to anyone during his years in the wilderness. He hadn't spoken much at all, in fact. But something about this old Mexican made him want to talk. Maybe it was the recognition he saw in Joaquin's eyes. Maybe it was the simple fact that, for the first time in years, someone had shown him kindness without wanting anything in return. Whatever the reason, Zachariah opened his mouth and let the entire story pour out. He told Joaquin everything. His mother's brutal death, his sister being sold away, Samuel hanging from that pecan tree, his desperate escape, his years alone in the wilderness, the names of the men he had sworn to kill: Thomas Birch, William Crawford, Colonel Henry Whitmore, and others too, the overseers who had whipped him, the slave catchers who had hunted him, every man who had ever treated him as property instead of a human being. When Zachariah finally finished, Joaquin remained quiet for a considerable time. The fire crackled softly between them. An owl called out somewhere in the darkness. Finally, the old man spoke. "You want revenge. I understand this feeling. I have wanted revenge for most of my own life. But wanting alone is not enough. Wanting will only get you killed." He looked at Zachariah with an expression that was almost sad. "You are angry. You are determined. But you are also untrained and unskilled. You wouldn't last 5 minutes against the men you intend to kill. They have guns. They have money. They have the full weight of the law on their side. You have nothing but hatred. Then teach me." Zachariah said immediately, "Teach me to be more than I am." Joaquin shook his head. "I came here specifically to escape violence, to find peace, to die quietly in these mountains and let my sins finally be forgotten." "Then why did you save me? Why didn't you just let me die?" The question hung heavily in the air between them. Joaquin stared into the fire for another long moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "Because I saw myself in you," he said quietly. "Because I know what it is to have everything you loved taken away. Because I was once a boy with nothing but hatred. And someone helped me when they didn't have to. I suppose I am repaying a debt I have owed for 40 years. He sighed deeply and stood up slowly, his aged joints cracking audibly with the effort. "I will teach you. But understand exactly what you're asking for. Once you walk this path, there is no coming back from it. The things I will teach you will change you forever. You will become a killer, and killers do not have the luxury of peace. Not in this life, perhaps not in the next one either." Zachariah didn't hesitate for a single second. "I stopped hoping for peace the day my mother died. All I want now is justice." Joaquin nodded slowly, a look of resignation on his weathered face. "Then we begin tomorrow." The training lasted 4 years. 4 years of brutal, unrelenting education in the art of violence. Joaquin was not a gentle teacher. He didn't believe in gentle methods. He believed that pain was the most effective instructor. That lessons learned through suffering were lessons that would never be forgotten. He pushed Zachariah to the very edge of his limits, and then pushed him even further. He systematically broke the boy down and then rebuilt him into something harder, something sharper, something genuinely deadly. The first year was focused entirely on the body. Zachariah learned to fight with his hands, with knives, with sticks, with anything that could be turned into a weapon. Joaquin taught him techniques drawn from a dozen different traditions: street fighting from the slums of Mexico City, knife work from the vaqueros, wrestling holds from the Comanche, pressure points that could paralyze or kill with a single, well-placed strike. Every single day, they sparred until Zachariah could barely stand. Every night, he nursed his bruises and mentally prepared for the next day's punishment. The second year focused on firearms. Joaquin was a master with both rifle and pistol, and he passed this mastery on to his student. Zachariah learned to shoot at targets while standing still, then while moving, and then while being shot at himself. He learned to draw and fire in a single, fluid motion so incredibly fast that the human eye could barely follow it. He learned to reload without looking, to clear jams by touch alone, to maintain his weapons in any condition imaginable. By the end of the second year, Zachariah could place 6 bullets through a single playing card at 20 paces in less than 3 seconds. Joaquin merely said he was adequate. The third year focused on the mind. This was the aspect of training that Zachariah hadn't anticipated. Joaquin insisted that violence without intelligence was just noise. A true fighter needed to understand his enemies, needed to predict their movements, needed to control his own emotions so completely that nothing could disturb his focus. They played chess for hours, Joaquin teaching Zachariah to think several moves ahead. They studied strategy and tactics, discussing famous battles and ambushes from history. They practiced meditation, sitting motionless for hours until Zachariah could finally quiet the storm inside his head and achieve perfect stillness. But the most important lesson came during that third year, and it had nothing directly to do with fighting at all. It was about patience. Revenge is not a fire, Joaquin said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. Fire burns hot and fast, and it destroys itself. Revenge is a coal. You keep it alive inside you, small and carefully controlled, feeding it just enough to keep it glowing. You wait, you watch, you prepare. And when the moment is exactly right, when everything is finally in place, then and only then, you blow on that coal and let it become an inferno. Not before. Never before. Zachariah took this lesson deeply to heart. He had been burning with impatience for years, wanting desperately to rush back to Texas and start killing immediately. Joaquin taught him to convert that urgency into intense focus. Every single day of training was another step closer to his ultimate goal. Every skill mastered was another weapon added to his arsenal. Rushing would only get him killed. Patience would bring him everything he wanted. The fourth year was dedicated to putting it all together. Joaquin staged elaborate scenarios out in the mountains, testing Zachariah's ability to plan, infiltrate, and execute missions against imaginary enemies. He brought in old contacts from his bandit days, former fighters who were willing to play the roles of guards and targets. Zachariah learned to thoroughly scout a location before attacking, to identify multiple escape routes, to anticipate potential complications, and to improvise effectively when plans inevitably fell apart. By the end of that fourth year, he was no longer a student. He was a weapon, owned, sharpened, and ready to be deployed. On the day Zachariah turned 20, Joaquin called him to the fire for one final conversation. The old man looked older than ever. His hair had gone completely white during their years together. His hands now trembled slightly. He moved more slowly, more carefully. Time was finally catching up with him. "You are ready?" Joaquin said. as ready as I can possibly make you. What you do now is your own choice, but I want you to understand something clearly before you go." Zachariah waited silently. "When I was young, I killed many men. Some of them deserved it. Some of them probably did not. I told myself I was fighting for justice, for my people, for revenge against those who had wronged us. And maybe some of that was even true. But here is what I have learned in my old age." Joaquin paused, carefully gathering his thoughts and his words. "Killing changes you. Every life you take carves something out of your soul. You don't notice it at first. You feel powerful, righteous. But over time, you slowly realize that parts of you are missing. The parts that could feel simple joy. The parts that could love. The parts that could imagine a future beyond the next target." He looked at Zachariah with eyes that held decades of accumulated regret. "I am not telling you not to go. The men who hurt you deserve to die. I genuinely believe this. But I want you to know the true cost beforehand. When you are finished, if you survive, you will not be the same person who started this journey. You may not like who you become, and there is no going back." Zachariah considered this for a long, thoughtful moment. He thought about his mother's face, his sister's desperate screams as she was taken away, Samuel's body swinging from that tree. He thought about every single scar on his back, every night he had spent alone and afraid, every piece of himself that had already been taken from him, long before he ever killed anyone. "They already took everything from me," he said finally. "Whatever is left, I'm willing to spend. Whatever I become, I'm willing to live with. They made me this way. They can die by what they created." Joaquin nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and withdrew 2 revolvers. They were Colt 1851 Navy models, beautifully maintained, with ivory grips that had yellowed considerably with age. "These were mine. When I was young, they have killed more men than I can even count. Now they are yours." He handed them to Zachariah with a certain ceremonial gravity. "Use them well. And when you are finished, if you find that you want to live, come back to these mountains. I will probably be dead by then, but the cabin will still be here. The garden will still be here. A place to rest, if you ever want to stop running." Zachariah took the guns. They felt absolutely perfect in his hands, balanced, deadly, extensions of his very will. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Joaquin smiled his thin, sad smile. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you've somehow survived." 3 days later, Zachariah Creed rode out of those mountains and back into the world of men. He carried Joaquin's revolvers on his hips, a rifle on his back, and a list of names burned into his memory. The very first name on that list was Thomas Birch. It took Zachariah 2 full months to locate him. After the war ended in 1865 and slavery was finally abolished, the old plantation system rapidly collapsed. Many former overseers scattered across Texas, searching for new opportunities in a dramatically changed world. Birch had drifted steadily west, eventually settling in a dusty, insignificant little town called Dusty Creek. About 100 miles from where the Whitmore plantation once stood, he now worked as a simple ranch hand, spending his meager wages on whiskey and telling anyone who would listen about the good old days when he used to keep slaves in line. Zachariah observed him for a full week before making his move. He studied Birch's routines meticulously: when he woke up, where he ate, which saloon he frequented, who his friends were, whether he carried a weapon. The answer to that last question was yes. A worn, neglected pistol that Birch kept on his hip more out of ingrained habit than any real skill. Zachariah noted that Birch's draw was painfully slow. His reflexes were dulled by years of heavy drinking. He posed no genuine threat. On the 7th day, Zachariah walked into that saloon at high noon. The room was crowded with ranch hands and drifters seeking relief from the brutal Texas sun. Birch sat at a table in the back, playing cards with 3 other men. He was heavier than Zachariah remembered. His face was red and bloated from years of drink, but those hands were unmistakably the same. The hands that had held the whip. The hands that had killed his mother. The room fell gradually silent as Zachariah approached. A black man walking into a white saloon was unusual enough. But a black man dressed entirely in black, with 2 gleaming pistols on his hips, moving with the unmistakable confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. That was something else entirely. Zachariah stopped directly at Birch's table. The card players looked up nervously. Birch squinted at the stranger, too drunk to sense the imminent danger. "Thomas Birch," Zachariah said. It wasn't a question. "Who wants to know?" Birch slurred. "You worked as an overseer on the Whitmore plantation before the war." Something flickered in Birch's eyes. A memory. A ghost. He straightened up slightly, trying to focus. What of it? That was a long time ago. Not long enough. Zachariah's voice was calm, almost gentle. "August 18th, 1858. You whipped a woman named Abigail 37 times. She died that night from her wounds." Birch's face went deathly pale. His hand started moving toward his pistol. But before his fingers could even touch the grip, he found himself staring down the barrel of Zachariah's Colt. The draw had been impossibly fast, too quick to see. One moment, Zachariah's hands were empty. The next, death itself was pointing directly at Birch's face. "I wouldn't," Zachariah said quietly. The other card players scrambled desperately away from the table, knocking over chairs in their haste to get clear. The rest of the saloon had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now. "Who are you?" Birch whispered. Zachariah leaned in close. "Abigail was my mother." "My name is Zachariah. It means God remembers." He watched recognition slowly dawn in Birch's terrified eyes. Fear followed close behind. "I told you once that I would find you. Did you think I had forgotten? Did you think God had forgotten?" Birch started to beg. His words tumbled out in a desperate, incoherent stream. He was sorry. He was only following orders. He was a different man now. He had changed. "Please, please, please." Zachariah listened patiently until the words finally ran out. Then he shook his head slowly. "My mother begged too. You didn't stop. Why should I?" The single gunshot echoed deafeningly through the silent room. Birch slumped forward onto the table, a neat hole in the center of his forehead. The card players were spattered with his blood. Someone screamed. Zachariah holstered his weapon calmly, turned, and walked back out the front door into the blinding afternoon sunlight. By the time anyone thought to follow, he had completely vanished. The news spread across Texas like wildfire. A black man had walked into a white saloon in broad daylight and killed a white man. Not in self-defense, not in a fair fight. This was an execution, cold-blooded and deliberate. The victim was a former overseer from a plantation. The killer was a former slave, and he had escaped without leaving a single trace. Within a week, wanted posters appeared in every town. $500 for information leading to the capture of the man they were now calling the Black Ghost. But no one had gotten a truly good look at him. No one knew his real name. He was just a tall, dark shadow that appeared, killed, and then vanished without a trace. Zachariah paid no attention to the posters. He was already moving on to the next name on his list. William Crawford, the slave trader who had purchased his sister Grace, proved more difficult to find. The slave trade had effectively ended with the war, and many former traders had moved into other lines of business. Crawford had successfully reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman in Houston, dealing in cotton and cattle. He lived in a fine house on a respectable street, attended church faithfully every Sunday, and was widely considered an upstanding member of the community. No one talked about how he had made his original fortune. No one wanted to remember. Zachariah spent 3 weeks carefully gathering information. He learned Crawford's schedule, his habits, his security arrangements. The man was far more careful than Birch had been. He kept armed guards at his house. He traveled with protection. He was afraid, though perhaps not of Zachariah specifically. Men who build their wealth on human suffering tend to accumulate many enemies. The solution presented itself one night as Zachariah watched Crawford's house from across the street. Every Tuesday evening, Crawford visited a private club on the edge of town, a place where wealthy men drank expensive whiskey and discussed business away from prying eyes. Crawford always attended these meetings alone. His guards waited outside. This was his vulnerability. On a Tuesday in October of 1873, Zachariah entered that club through a back window, while the staff was distracted with the evening service. He moved through the shadows, like the ghost people were calling him, avoiding the few servants and club employees he encountered. He found Crawford in a private room, sitting alone with a glass of bourbon, waiting for his associates to arrive. Crawford looked up when the door opened. His eyes widened dramatically when he saw the tall black man in black clothing standing there. He wasn't stupid. He had heard about the killing in Dusty Creek. He knew immediately why this stranger was here. "You're him," Crawford breathed. "The one they're looking for." Zachariah closed the door behind him. "William Crawford, in 1859, you came to the Whitmore plantation and purchased a 6-year-old girl named Grace. You paid $400 for her." Crawford's hand moved instinctively toward the bell on the table, the one that would summon his guards. Zachariah drew and fired in a single, fluid motion. The bullet shattered Crawford's wrist. The man screamed in agony, clutching his bleeding hand. "That was a warning," Zachariah said calmly. "The next one won't be." "Where is she?" Crawford was sobbing now, tears and snot running down his face. "Woo, I don't know what you're talking about. I bought and sold hundreds of slaves." "Do you expect me to remember one particular child? Her name was Grace. She was my sister. You took her from the Whitmore plantation. Where did she go?" Crawford shook his head desperately. "I don't know. I don't keep records of individual sales." "She could have been sold anywhere. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. I honestly don't remember." Zachariah studied the man's face intently. He was telling the truth. He genuinely did not remember. Grace had been nothing to him, just merchandise. Just $400 changing hands. He had probably forgotten her name before his carriage even left the plantation. Something inside Zachariah went very, very cold. He had hoped, despite everything, that Crawford might possess some information, some clue that would help him find his sister. Instead, he had encountered only emptiness. Grace was gone, lost forever in the vast, inhuman machinery of slavery. He would probably never know what had happened to her. "You don't even remember," Zachariah said softly. "She was 6 years old. She screamed for me when you took her. She reached out her little hands. And you don't even remember." Crawford must have seen death itself in Zachariah's eyes. He started babbling again, desperately offering money, offering to help search for the girl, offering anything and everything. "Please, please." Zachariah raised his pistol. "When you get to hell, tell them Zachariah sent you. Tell them God remembers." The second shot was as clean and final as the first. Over the next 18 months, Zachariah systematically worked his way through the entire list. James Thornton, the sheriff who had ordered Samuel's hanging, was found dead in his own office with a note pinned to his chest that simply read, "Remembered." Robert Hayes, a doctor who had branded runaway slaves on the face, was discovered in his clinic with his own branding iron pressed firmly into his own forehead. 2 former overseers from the Whitmore plantation died within a week of each other. One was shot in a stable. The other was shot in his own bedroom. The pattern was always identical: a single bullet, a message, a ghost that simply could not be caught. The legend of Zachariah, vengeance, creed grew with each killing. Some people whispered that he was a demon summoned by slave magic. Others claimed he was a dead man returned from the grave. Still others insisted he didn't exist at all, that the killings were the work of multiple men who had adopted a single, fearsome identity. The truth was far stranger. He was simply a man who had been grievously wronged. A man who had decided that if the law would not provide justice, he would provide it himself. Not everyone Zachariah killed was on his original list. Word of his existence spread quietly through the black communities of Texas, passed in whispers from church to church, from family to family. Sometimes people would seek him out. They would tell him about men who had committed terrible crimes during slavery, masters who had murdered slaves for sport, overseers who had raped women and killed their husbands, traders who had specialized in separating children from their mothers. These men had never faced any consequences whatsoever. The law did not consider crimes against slaves to be crimes at all. Zachariah listened carefully to these stories. He investigated when he could, and when he confirmed that the stories were true, he added new names to his ever-growing list. He became something more than a personal avenger. He became a symbol, a promise that the crimes of slavery would not be conveniently forgotten. That somewhere out there, someone was keeping count, someone was remembering, and someone was making the guilty pay. The bounty on his head rose to $1,000, then $2,000, then $5,000. The governor of Texas declared him public enemy number 1. Posses were formed. Bounty hunters were hired. Texas Rangers were deployed. None of them could catch him. Zachariah moved like smoke, appearing and disappearing at will. He had learned from Joe Keene how to survive in the wilderness. He had developed contacts within the black communities who provided shelter and information. He was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a nightmare that simply would not end. By the summer of 1875, only one name remained on Zachariah's original list: Colonel Henry Whitmore. Whitmore had not fared well after the war. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed his slaves. The Union victory had destroyed his fortune. The cotton market had collapsed entirely. He had been forced to sell most of his land to pay accumulating debts. The grand plantation house had fallen into serious disrepair. The fields lay fallow and overgrown. By 1875, Whitmore was a mere shell of his former self, living in that crumbling mansion with a handful of hired guns, spending his days drinking heavily and cursing the world that had taken everything from him. But Whitmore was not stupid. He knew his name was on Zachariah's list. He had heard about the deaths of Birch and Crawford and all the others. He knew that, sooner or later, the ghost would come for him, so he prepared. He hired the very best gunfighters he could still afford. 20 men, each with a fearsome reputation for violence. He fortified his mansion with barricades and firing positions. He established a rotation of guards who watched the approaches day and night. He turned his decaying plantation into a fortress, determined to make his final stand there if necessary. Let him come, Whitmore told his men, a glass of whiskey trembling in his spotted hand. Let that animal come. I'll show him what happens when property forgets its proper place. I'll hang his body from the very same tree where I hung that thieving boy all those years ago. Let him come. On the night of September 15, 1875, Zachariah came. He approached the plantation from the west, moving silently through the overgrown cotton fields, that had once been tended by slaves. The moon was full, but hidden behind clouds, casting the world into deep darkness. He could see the lights of the mansion in the distance. He could make out the silhouettes of guards on the porch and at the windows. 20 men, all armed, all waiting specifically for him. Zachariah smiled. He had faced far worse odds. He began picking off the outer guards, one by one. A shot from the darkness. A body falling. Silence. The other guards spun toward the sound, but there was nothing to see. Another shot. Another body. Then another. Panic began to spread rapidly. Men who had been confident in their superior numbers started to realize that numbers meant absolutely nothing against an enemy they couldn't even see. Within 10 minutes, 8 men were dead. The remaining 12 had retreated inside the mansion, barricading the doors and windows. They fired blindly into the darkness, wasting precious ammunition on shadows. They shouted at each other, their voices pitched high with fear. Zachariah circled the house, patient as a wolf. He fired through windows, picking off anyone foolish enough to show themselves. He set fire to the kitchen building, filling the night with smoke and confusion. He shot out the lanterns, one by one, plunging the mansion into complete darkness. By midnight, only 4 gunfighters remained. They huddled together in the main parlor with Whitmore, their backs to each other, their guns pointed nervously at every door and window. The old colonel was shaking uncontrollably now. The whiskey had worn off. The grim reality of his situation had fully set in. He was going to die tonight. All his money, all his hired guns, all his elaborate preparations. They meant nothing against this demon he himself had created. Zachariah's voice came from somewhere in the darkness outside. "Send out Whitmore. The rest of you can leave. This is between him and me." The 4 gunfighters looked at each other. They looked at Whitmore. They made their decision very quickly. One of them grabbed the old man and began dragging him toward the door.
"No!"
Whitmore screamed. "No, you can't. I paid you." "You didn't pay us enough for this," the gunfighter said flatly. He threw open the front door and shoved Whitmore out into the night. Then he and his companions ran out the back, disappearing into the darkness, leaving the colonel completely alone. Whitmore lay in the dirt of his own front yard, weeping. His fine clothes were stained and torn. His white hair was wild and disabled. His hands clawed uselessly at the ground, as if trying to dig a hole to hide in. He looked nothing like the powerful man who had once owned 112 human beings. He looked like exactly what he was, a pathetic, frightened old coward finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. Zachariah emerged from the shadows. He walked slowly, deliberately, savoring this moment. He had waited 17 long years for this. Since the day his mother died. Since the day his sister was taken. Since the day Samuel was hanged. 17 years of pain and survival and relentless preparation. All of it leading to this single moment. He stopped just a few feet from Whitmore. The old man looked up at him, his eyes red and swollen from weeping. "Please," Whitmore whispered. "Please don't kill me. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry." Zachariah stood over him for a long contemplative moment, looking down at the man who had caused so much unimaginable suffering. He remembered his mother's face. Her voice singing hymns in the morning. Her whisper in his ear, telling him that God remembers. He remembered Grace's small hands reaching desperately for him. He remembered Samuel's body swinging from that tree. He remembered every single scar on his back. Every night of hunger, every moment of fear and pain and loss. Then Zachariah did something he hadn't planned. Something that surprised even himself. He holstered his gun. "I'm not going to kill you," he said. Whitmore looked up, utterly confused, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "You're not. Then you'll let me go." Zachariah shook his head slowly. No, you're not going anywhere. You're going to live, Whitmore. You're going to live right here, in this ruin you used to call home. You're going to watch everything you built crumble completely to dust. You're going to wake up every single morning knowing that you lost everything. Your slaves, your money, your power, your pride, all of it gone. And you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life looking over your shoulder, wondering if I'll change my mind, wondering if this is the day I come back to finish what I started. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. Death is too easy for you. You don't get to escape that quickly. You get to live. And every day you live, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that a slave stood over you while you groveled in the dirt. You'll remember that your property beat you. And when you finally die, old and alone and completely forgotten, the last thing you'll see is my mother's face. Because God remembers. And now, you will too. Zachariah turned and walked away. Behind him, Whitmore collapsed back into the dirt, sobbing uncontrollably. The mansion continued to burn through the night, sending flames high into the Texas sky. True to Zachariah's word, Whitmore lived. He was found the next morning wandering the ruins of his plantation, muttering incoherently to himself. He spent the remaining years of his life in a sanatorium, tormented by constant nightmares and waking visions. The doctors said his mind had completely broken. They said he screamed constantly about a man in black who was coming to get him. They said he died alone in 1883, calling out for mercy to someone only he could see. As for Zachariah Creed, he simply disappeared after that night. The killing stopped abruptly. The ghost vanished without a trace. Bounty hunters searched for years, but found absolutely nothing. Some people claimed he had been killed in Mexico. Others said he had gone north to Canada. Still others insisted he had never really existed at all, that he was just a story of slaves told to frighten their former masters. But in the black communities of Texas, a different story was quietly passed down. A story about a man who returned to those mountains, where an old Mexican gunfighter had taught him everything he knew. They said he found the cabin still standing, the garden still growing. They said he buried Joaquin Esparza with his own hands in a grave overlooking the canyon where they had spent 4 years together. They said he hung up his guns and never killed again. Some said he started helping escaped slaves make their way north. Some said he became a protector of black communities, appearing whenever trouble came and disappearing just as quickly when it was over. Some said he lived to be very, very old, a quiet, solitary man with sad eyes who never spoke about his past, but who moved with the unmistakable grace of someone who had been trained to kill. Whether any of this is actually true, no one can say for certain. The historical records are incomplete. The witnesses are long dead. All we have left is the legend of Zachariah, Vengeance, Creed, the boy who watched his mother die, the slave who escaped and learned to fight, the ghost who returned to make the guilty pay, the man who chose mercy when he had every possible reason to choose death. His story is not simply about revenge. It is about what slavery did to people, to the enslaved and to the enslavers alike. It is about the violence that was woven into the very fabric of American society for 250 years. It is about the debts that were never paid and the crimes that were never punished. It is about children who were stolen from their parents and parents who never, ever stopped searching for their children. Every name on Zachariah's list represented a real type of person who existed within the slavery system. The overseers who wielded the whips, the traders who tore families apart, the masters who genuinely believed they had the right to own other human beings. These people were not aberrations. They were the system itself, working exactly as designed. And when that system finally ended, when the 13th Amendment declared slavery abolished, most of them faced absolutely no consequences at all. They kept their land. They kept their money. They kept their social standing. They simply adapted to new forms of exploitation and continued on as before. Zachariah Creed represents something that the system feared above all else, the idea that the enslaved might remember, that they might return, that there might actually be a price to pay for centuries of unimaginable cruelty. This fear haunted white Southerners throughout the entire era of slavery and far beyond. It drove them to create ever more oppressive laws and ever more brutal systems of control. They knew deep down that what they were doing was wrong, and they knew that wrongdoing, sooner or later, demands an accounting. The story of Zachariah is fictional, but the world he inhabited was absolutely real. The violence he experienced was real. The systems he fought against were real. The children who were stolen, the families who were destroyed, the lives that were crushed under the weight of slavery. All of that was horrifyingly real. And the descendants of those children, those families, those crushed lives, they are still here, still carrying the weight of that history, still waiting for an accounting that has never ever come. When Zachariah's mother named him, she chose a name that meant, God remembers. She believed that someday, somehow, justice would finally arrive, that the suffering of her people would not be conveniently forgotten, that the crimes committed against them would not go unpunished forever. She did not live to see that justice. Neither did Zachariah. Not really. The men he killed were a tiny fraction of those truly responsible for slavery. The system itself continued in new forms for generations after his story ended. But the name remains, Zachariah. God remembers. And now, you remember too. You know this story now. You know what was done. You know the names of the guilty and the faces of the innocent. You know that slavery did not simply end in 1865. It evolved, it adapted, it found new ways to extract black labor and destroy black families. And some of that evolution continues, even to this very day. The question that Zachariah's story asks is not whether revenge is justified. That is a question each person must answer for themselves. The question is both simpler and far harder. Will we remember? Will we face the truth of what was actually done? Will we acknowledge the debts that were never paid and the wounds that were never healed? Will we build a future that genuinely honors the suffering of the past? Zachariah Creed found his own answer high in the mountains of West Texas. He chose vengeance, then chose mercy, then chose silence. He disappeared into history, leaving only a legend behind him. But legends have undeniable power. They remind us of what is possible. They remind us that even in the very darkest times, there are those who absolutely refuse to submit, those who fight back, those who remember. His mother's voice still echoes across all these years. God remembers every hurt, every tear, every wrong done to his children. And one day, he will make it right. The story of Zachariah Creed is now over. But the story of America, the story of slavery and its long aftermath, the story of injustice and the endless struggle for justice, that story continues. It continues in every black family that carries the trauma of ancestors they never knew. It continues in every community that still fights for equality. It continues in every classroom where this history is taught and every living room where it is discussed. It continues in you, right now, because you know. Remember, that is all the dead have ever asked of us. Remember what was done. Remember who did it. Remember who suffered, and build a world where it can never, ever happen again.